Something just happened at Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton, yes. Hamilton has spotted detail in Leclerc's SF25 that even Maranello's engineers missed. It happened during FP1 in Mexico, under brutal heat and air, so thin it plays tricks on engines and minds alike. And what began as a routine practice run turned into one of the most revealing technical discoveries of the season. For Hamilton, who's driven cars on both sides of perfection, it was instinct. "That floor's breathing too much," he said, watching Leclerc countersteer through the S's. The engineers double-checked the data, and there it was a half-millimeter deflection in the floor's rear section that disturbed the airflow sealing into the diffuser. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to cause the very oscillation that Leclerc had described the week before, a momentary loss of rear confidence under throttle. The revelation stunned the team. The SF25's strength, its agility in low-speed corners, was being undermined by an unseen structural quirk, and it took Hamilton's trained eye to catch it in real time. Leclerc, meanwhile, was unfazed. His lap times kept dropping. He clocked a brilliant 1 minute and 18.380 seconds, topping FP1 ahead of Antonelli's Mercedes and Hülkenberg's Sauber. In a session where 9 rookie drivers filled the grid, Leclerc's precision made the difference. He managed the soft compound Pirellis perfectly, running just as the track reached its ideal grip window. But behind that performance lay the deeper story, the invisible battle between aerodynamics and balance that Ferrari has fought all year. Hamilton's discovery didn't undermine Leclerc's pace. He explained it. The car was fast because he was driving around a limitation. By the halfway mark, the Ferrari engineers gathered around the telemetry displays, Hamilton included. They saw the same aerodynamic pulse repeating lap after lap. The conclusion was unanimous. The SF25's underfloor stiffness wasn't linear under load. That inconsistency distorted airflow and shifted balance dynamically between the front and rear. For any other driver, this would have been a nightmare. For Leclerc, it became an art form. He used brake modulation and steering angle to smooth out the imbalance without ever lifting off unnecessarily. It was a masterclass in control under uncertainty. The first practice session in Mexico exposed a truth that Ferrari had quietly suspected but never confirmed. The SF25, though fast in qualifying trim, hides a fragile equilibrium in its aerodynamics. Under certain conditions, heat, altitude, and track undulation, the floor behaves unpredictably. What Hamilton saw from the data screens and Leclerc felt from the cockpit was the same phenomenon, described differently, an underbody that breathed under load. In plain engineering terms, the carbon floor was flexing fractionally at high downforce peaks, altering the aerodynamic seal and robbing the rear axle stability just when the car needed it most. Leclerc, ever sensitive to balance shifts, detected the flaw instinctively. His radio messages were concise but telling. "Rear feels inconsistent," he said after his third run. To the untrained ear, that sounds like a typical complaint, but Hamilton knew that phrasing. It's what drivers say when the car isn't giving them back what they put in when the grip arrives a fraction late, when the downforce moves faster than the tires can follow. It was a symptom of aerodynamic breathing, a problem Ferrari hadn't fully pinned down since Suzuka. What made the situation fascinating was how differently the two Ferraris responded. Carlos Sainz struggled to keep temperature in the rear tires, over-rotating on entry and losing the rhythm through the stadium sector. Leclerc, by contrast, adjusted instantly. He shortened his steering inputs, smoothed his throttle trace, and rebalanced the car mid-corner with micro-brake pressure, a move so subtle it barely registered on telemetry. It was a driving style forged by trust in his own perception rather than the car's feedback. Where the SF25 hesitated, Leclerc filled the gap with intuition. That adaptability turned a flaw into a strength. Inside the Ferrari garage, the tension was visible. Engineers debated whether the deflection Hamilton noticed could be influencing rear ride height. The numbers were small, less than a millimeter of variation, but at 320 kilometers per hour, that's enough to disrupt the entire aerodynamic map. The data showed oscillations in pressure readings across the floor that coincided exactly with Leclerc's steering corrections. It wasn't coincidence. Every movement he made in the cockpit was a reaction to the car's changing behavior beneath him. And yet, the lap times didn't suffer. That's the mark of a great driver, one who hides the car's weaknesses so well that they look like strengths. Hamilton, standing near the engineer's monitors, understood that immediately. He's driven cars that behave the same way, dominant on paper, unstable in the real world. He turned to the Ferrari performance analyst and said quietly, "He's driving around it. He's not fighting the car, he's translating it." That comment spread through the team like wildfire. It wasn't criticism, it was respect. Leclerc wasn't being carried by the Ferrari, he was carrying it. His ability to process and correct the SF25's inconsistencies in real time gave Ferrari the illusion of stability when the car itself was on a knife's edge. By the time FP1 ended, the engineers had gathered enough evidence to confirm Hamilton's observation. The underfloor deflection was measurable, repeatable, and real. But what made headlines internally wasn't the defect, it was the driver's response to it. Leclerc's telemetry showed consistency unmatched by anyone on the grid, including Verstappen. His throttle application was smoother, his braking more progressive, and his energy recovery deployment perfectly timed to stabilize the car under load. In short, he was compensating for a structural limitation, using pure feel. Mexico City, with its high-altitude air and thin oxygen, exposes weaknesses that remain hidden elsewhere. The air density drops by nearly 25% compared to sea level, cutting both engine power and downforce. Most cars respond with predictable balance, changes a bit more sliding, a touch more understeer. But Ferrari's SF25 reacted differently. The car's aerodynamic surfaces, so finely tuned for sea-level precision, began to oscillate under reduced pressure. The floor flex that Hamilton had spotted earlier wasn't just a minor structural curiosity, it became a live variable, affecting everything from brake cooling to tire wear. In the Ferrari garage, the reaction was immediate. Engineers huddled around the data screens while aerodynamicists began running instant simulations. Hamilton stood nearby, engaged in quiet discussion with Jacques Clear and Ravin Jain, both senior members of Ferrari's performance group. His observation had triggered a technical ripple effect. The question wasn't whether the floor flexed that was confirmed, but how it interacted with the SF25's newly revised diffuser and under-tray geometry. When the airflow underneath the car detached even momentarily, it created a pocket of low pressure that reduced rear grip. And yet, Leclerc's lap traces showed minimal time loss. Somehow, he was maintaining rhythm through a car that physically refused to stay consistent. Leclerc's on-track discipline was surgical. He didn't chase lap times, he chased understanding. Run after run, he adjusted one variable at a time: brake balance, diff preload, power delivery, until the engineers could map precisely how the car's aerodynamics evolved through each corner sequence. The brilliance lay not in the raw numbers, but in the symmetry of his inputs. Every steering correction had a corresponding throttle modulation, allowing Ferrari's telemetry to capture patterns no simulator could reproduce. By the end of the session, they had what the factory needed: real, high-altitude flow data from a driver who could repeat every lap within 0.2. It was the kind of precision that turns guesswork into science. Hamilton, watching the traces in silence, was visibly impressed. He knows what it means to fight a car's aero inconsistency. He lived through it at Mercedes in 2022. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a critique, but admiration. "He's stabilizing the aero through energy transfer," he said, meaning Leclerc was using throttle input to counteract aerodynamic load shifts, an advanced technique that only a handful of drivers in history have mastered. It's what separates fast drivers from complete ones, the ability to read air pressure through feel rather than through instruments. Ferrari's engineers began responding in kind. They altered the ride height by a millimeter at the rear and slightly softened the third spring to counteract the floor's breathing. Instantly, the oscillations in the telemetry flattened out. The correlation was there. The SF25 was sensitive to vertical load variation. But rather than panic, the team used it as a chance to remap their development baseline. Leclerc's communication was so precise that every change produced measurable improvement. It wasn't just a driver giving feedback, it was a driver leading the engineering process. As the track temperature climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, other teams began suffering with tire degradation. Ferrari, however, held consistent pace. The small adjustments stabilized the car enough for Leclerc to push in the final 10 minutes. His lap times dropped again 1 minute and 18.2 seconds, then 1 minute and 18 seconds, edging out both Red Bulls and Mercedes despite the imbalance that still lingered beneath. When he returned to the pits, the garage burst into quiet applause, not because of the time itself, but because they understood what it represented, the moment their driver turned a limitation into data-driven progress. By the end of FP1, Hamilton's initial remark had become a full-scale technical directive. Ferrari engineers prepared a detailed structural analysis of the floor for the night shift, comparing it to Red Bull's 2024 solution that had used flexible composite layering to achieve controlled breathing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Hamilton, who once fought Ferrari for supremacy, was now the one who helped them identify their next upgrade path. And Leclerc, who had endured months of speculation about Ferrari's inconsistency, emerged from the session not as a frustrated driver, but as the calm anchor of a team rediscovering its rhythm.